They were just two shadows riding into Zion, an ex-sniper father and his quiet, sketchbook-carrying son. No distress call, no signal, no bodies. Just tire tracks that vanished into sand like breath into the wind. 9 months later, a man who once killed beside the father walked that same trail, chasing a dream. And found something buried beneath the rocks, a journal that didn't explain what happened, but whispered something worse. They weren't running from something. They were running toward it. The trail began like any other, a sliver of dirt winding through the sandstone cathedral of Zion, framed by towering cliffs and the rustle of wind-carved cottonwoods. Tire tracks, faint and fragile, etched their path into the earth like signatures in dust. Then, as abruptly as a breath held too long, they vanished, swallowed by shifting sands and time. At first, it looked like nothing. Just another patch of desert trail blurred by wind. But something was off. Before we follow the final trail of James and Noah, and the chilling journal left buried beneath Zion's silent cliffs, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Your support allows us to keep telling the stories that were never supposed to be found. The ones written in ashes, shadows, and silence. Every subscription is a light we carry into the dark, searching for the truths left behind. A simple click from you helps us honor the missing, the forgotten, and the questions still echoing through the canyons. Thank you. There were no continuation tracks, no skid marks, no signs of return. Only the silence, the kind of silence that presses in on you, that doesn't feel empty, but watchful. Rangers passed by it once, then again. Finally they stopped, stared, and called it in. Not because they knew what was wrong, just that something was. That was 9 months ago. The search began in heat and urgency. A veteran named James Renner and his teenage son, Noah, had signed in at the south entrance gate. 2 mountain bikes, 2 backpacks, a week's worth of supplies. They waved politely to the ranger on duty. Their permits were in order. No red flags, no warnings. Just a father and son heading into the wild, like so many before them. They were never seen again. No one heard a distress call. No signal ever pinged from James's phone, though it had a satellite backup. The weather was clear. The terrain, though remote, was well marked. But when they missed their exit checkpoint and didn't return their camping pass, Zion's search and rescue was alerted. The park mobilized drones, helicopters, volunteers, dogs. Over 6 days, they scoured over 30 square miles. Nothing. Not a body. Not a shoe. Not a torn pack. The wind had erased them. The canyon kept its secrets. At the parking lot, James's truck still sat dusty, but locked. Inside, an open map, a folded drawing of a cave marked with a star, and a single empty thermos in the cup holder. Noah's skateboard was in the back seat, a quiet reminder that he was just a kid. That somewhere in this endless cathedral of stone and silence, a boy had disappeared alongside his father without leaving so much as a whisper. What haunted those who searched wasn't just the absence, it was the absence of struggle. Everything looked peaceful. Too peaceful. Their tire tracks simply ended. No signs of panic, no erratic detour. It was as though the earth had opened, taken them, and closed itself again. Locals whispered, of course. Zion's canyons have a history longer than any park ranger's memory. Tales of ghost riders, watchers on the cliffs, voices in the wind. But no one said that aloud at the briefings. Instead, they spoke of dehydration, heat stroke, maybe even foul play. Quietly though, the ones who'd spent the most time out there, those who'd seen the sun move across those rocks like a slow blade, kept asking the same question. How does a man trained to survive war disappear without a trace? And how does his son follow? As the months wore on, the case moved to the cold files. Press coverage faded, tips dried up. The desert moved on. But that trailhead remained. And on certain mornings, If you stood there long enough and let the wind settle, you could almost hear tires crunching dirt. A low voice. A boy's laughter echoing against stone. Then nothing. Just the trail, just the red cliffs, just silence. They arrived just after noon, sunlight casting sharp silhouettes across the cracked pavement of the visitor center parking lot. The desert heat hadn't yet reached its punishing peak, but already it shimmered off the hoods of parked cars like ghosts rising. James Renner stepped out of his truck first, lean, deliberate, every movement compact, measured. His son, Noah, followed close behind, barely taller than the packs they hauled from the truck bed. They moved in rhythm. Not in conversation, not with smiles, but in a silence that had learned to be comfortable. They weren't new to this. The camping permits had been filled out meticulously. Routes mapped, supplies counted twice. Their bikes, strapped tight to the hitch rack, were worn with history mud-stained and scratched from previous trips through Moab, Sedona, and the San Juans. But Zion was different. This was sacred ground, James had once said. Something about it called to him. Maybe it was the vastness. Maybe it was the silence. Or maybe it was the way the canyons narrowed the world down to only what you could carry, what you could hold. Noah didn't ask why they kept doing this, disappearing into places where cell signals died and roads gave way to dust. He understood without words. His father didn't show affection with hugs or stories. He showed it by keeping pace, by handing over the better canteen, by adjusting Noah's helmet strap without saying a thing. Love, for James, was something earned in motion, not spoken in stillness. They signed the register at the trailhead kiosk. James used a pen from his pocket, not the one chained to the board. Precise block letters: Renner, James, and Noah. Entry: 8/14. Expected exit: 8/21. Below that, he wrote, Backcountry route, collab section, 2 bikes. Prepared. Then, almost as an afterthought, he drew a small dot near an unmarked bend on the map posted under the plexiglass. A place he had circled weeks earlier at home, during one of his late-night satellite map sessions. Noah had asked him what it was. Somewhere quiet, James replied. The trail began without ceremony, just dust, juniper, and Sunday. Their tires spun in soft rhythm, slicing through gravel as their shadows stretched long behind them. Twin silhouettes riding into the burnished light. There were GoPros mounted to their handlebars, quietly recording the beginning. They filmed everything. Not for show, not for social media, just for the archive. James believed in documenting proof. Not of where they'd been, but of who they'd been when they were there. Midway into their route, they paused near a high overlook. A vast bowl of red rock and silence opened before them. Noah took a photo. James didn't. He just stood there, eyes scanning the ridgelines like he always did, habit, instinct, watching nothing, listening for something. Then he turned, nodded once, and they pressed on. That was the last confirmed sighting. The GoPros were never recovered. Neither was the camera. But one photo made it back, uploaded days earlier from a gas station Wi-Fi hotspot. Noah had tagged it Day 1. It showed a glimpse of the valley behind them. James's face was half-shadowed. Noah's eyes squinted against the Sunday. Behind them, Zion stretched into forever. They looked like two people who had done this before. Like they knew the land, like they belonged to it. But that photo would become their last timestamp, their last known position in time. From that point forward, the trail bends into shadow. And neither of them came out the other side. James Renner rarely spoke about the war. Not because he couldn't remember, but because he remembered everything. The exact weight of his rifle. The way heat distorted the horizon in Basra. The silence that followed a confirmed kill. He'd served 3 tours, 2 in Iraq, 1 in Afghanistan, as a sniper embedded with special operations teams. His record was clean, even exemplary. He was awarded for precision, commended for discipline, feared by enemies he never met. But the medals came home to a man who had changed shape entirely. Back in civilian life, James was quiet in a way that unnerved people. Not withdrawn, not hostile, just elsewhere. He worked short stints in security, kept mostly to himself, and never spoke more than necessary. Crowds made him flinch. Sudden noises tightened his jaw. Fireworks in July? He'd drive out to the edge of town and wait in silence until the sky stopped exploding. The world had kept moving, but James had been carved by a place where time meant something else, where seconds could mean survival, and hours could stretch like lifetimes. Therapists called it PTSD. He called it the price of coming home. But there was one thing that tethered him: his son, Noah. Born between tours, raised in the soft spaces between deployments and VA appointments, James didn't always know how to talk to Noah. Small talk felt foreign. Questions about school seemed trivial. But what he could do was show up. Build routines. Create rituals. Fix the bike. Sharpen the blades. Pack the gear, plan the route. Their trips began small. Day hikes, then weekend camps. Eventually, multi-day bike treks across remote landscapes. James believed in the kind of movement that pushed everything else out of your mind. No distractions, no noise, just breath, terrain, and forward motion. It wasn't therapy in the conventional sense, no couches, no notebooks, but it healed something in him. Or at least quieted the things that wouldn't let go. Noah took to the silence easily. He didn't push, he didn't pry. He just pedaled beside his father, always a step behind or ahead, never too far. Over time, they became something more than family. They became unit. Formation. Two lives shaped by absence and presence. Shadow and light. James once wrote in a rarely opened notebook, "He is what I wanted to be before the war, and what I need to remember after it." Zion was meant to be different. More than just another checkpoint on their map. It was a place James had read about during nights when sleep refused to come. A place sacred to the people who walked it first. A place where silence didn't haunt, but held. He told Noah they'd take the old backcountry path, just the two of them, far from tourists and trails with cell reception. No itinerary. No expectations. Just 1 week in the breath between cliffs. His sister had asked him before the trip, "Are you doing okay, really?" James had nodded, said, "Better in the quiet." She didn't press. He left behind no suicide notes, no strange behavior, no indication that this trip was any different from the others. But what no one saw was what had been building over years: memories without rest, sleep without dreams, a mind that could remember every shot but not always the reason it had been fired. Zion was supposed to be healing. It was supposed to be where the silence would soothe, where the land would hold what the world couldn't. And maybe, for a few days, it did. Until it didn't. The truck sat alone at the trailhead, its paint bleached slightly from the August Sunday dust, clung to the windshield like a second skin, and dead insects patterned the grill in fading Rorschach shapes. It had been there long enough for someone to notice, but not long enough for alarm. Zion had its share of extended stays. People lost time in places like this. Days blurred into rock and wind. Still, a ranger doing a routine sweep grew uneasy. The vehicle hadn't moved. Park records showed James Renner had signed in 8 days prior, with an expected return on the 7th. It was now the 9th. A phone call was made. A name checked. Then another. And then the stillness around the truck began to take on weight. Inside, everything was intact. A road map lay folded open on the passenger seat, marked faintly with pencil. A thermos sat empty in the center console. There was no mess, no panic. Just the eerie calm of something left behind. The bikes were gone, but the mount straps were still tight, suggesting they'd been removed with care. Not rushed, not stolen. Rangers began combing the nearby area. Within a half-mile of the trailhead, they found tire tracks, 2 sets, spaced closely. Mountain bike treads cutting clean through the sand. They followed them, eyes trained, radios crackling faintly against the hum of desert wind. The tracks continued for nearly 2 miles. Then, like breath dissipating in cold air, they vanished. There was no fork in the trail, no riverbed to explain their disappearance. The path didn't lead into dense brush or a ravine. It simply ended. Teams fanned out. Drones were dispatched, their cameras sweeping the canyon from above, scanning for movement, color, disturbance. Dogs were brought in, trained to pick up scent even days old. But the desert had already taken its toll. Wind had scoured the ground clean. Heat had baked away what little human trace remained. No footprints, no rappers, no signs of a campfire. No voices answering the call of their names. They expanded the search radius. Satellite imagery was reviewed. A few pieces of discarded gear were discovered several days later, half buried beneath a rise of rock. A canteen. A cracked compass. But again, no signs of distress. No struggle. The items looked placed rather than dropped. Intact, undisturbed, almost staged. Rumors began to hum beneath the surface. Staff who had worked the park for decades said this felt different. Not like a fall or a heat stroke or even an animal attack. Something about it didn't add up. James Renner wasn't an amateur. His military background made it hard to believe he'd get lost, let alone make a fatal mistake. And if something had happened to him, why hadn't Noah tried to find help? Why was there no call from the satellite phone James had registered on entry? The case was logged as a high-priority missing persons report. For 6 weeks, the search continued. Daily at first, then weekly. Until eventually, the rhythm slowed. Resources were reallocated. The news cycle moved on. The desert did what it always does, it waited. Fall crept in, and with it, a coldness that cut through the red stone. Winter passed in silence. The truck was eventually towed, after authorization from the family. But the parking space it left behind became a kind of quiet shrine, a scar in the dust, a reminder. Something had broken in the sand, something that didn't leave pieces behind. Noah Renner was the kind of boy who didn't draw attention in a room, he drew it on paper. While other kids fidgeted or blurted or chased noise, Noah observed. He watched with the kind of silence that made people uneasy, as though he saw things they didn't mean to show. At 15, he was already taller than his mother had been, though she had passed when he was too young to remember her voice. His eyes were pale gray, like overcast water, and his fingers were always stained with graphite. He didn't talk much, not because he couldn't, but because words felt unnecessary. He preferred pencils. He filled notebooks with sketches of trees, of strangers, of cracked pavement and curled leaves. But mostly, he drew his father. Always from a distance. Always in motion. A figure crouched by a campfire, a silhouette checking gear beneath a starless sky. The shape of a man looking outward, but never back. In school, Noah was labeled, quietly exceptional. He turned in assignments with meticulous detail, but rarely spoke in class. When asked about group projects, he would glance sideways and nod, but his work always stood on its own. A counselor once described him as carrying an old sadness, like he'd seen something he shouldn't have and decided never to talk about it. His art teachers, though, saw something else, a precision, an emotional clarity that seemed too knowing for his age. When they asked about his inspiration, he always gave the same answer: the quiet parts. His bond with his father was complex but close. There was no softness in their dynamic, no bedtime stories or catch in the yard. What they shared was wordless understanding. When James packed a rucksack, Noah knew which pocket to check. When James adjusted his rifle at a shooting range, Noah instinctively covered his ears 2 seconds before the shot. They communicated in glances, in routines, in the shared silence between movements. James once said, half-jokingly, "He doesn't follow me. He echoes me." The name stuck. Echo. Not a nickname so much as a second identity. It was what James called him on the trail, during their long bike rides. A call-out, a tether. "You good, Echo? Stay close, Echo." He was in so many ways his father's shadow, but not in the diminished sense. Echo didn't mean lesser. It meant carried, remembered, repeated. There were, of course, moments where Noah glimpsed the fractures in James, the distant stare during lightning storms, the nights he awoke in the tent with his father already outside, pacing the dark. But he never asked. Instead, he'd quietly unzip his sketchbook, turn on his red lens headlamp, and draw. In those pages, he tried to catch the pieces of his father that war had stolen, trace them back into something whole. In the weeks before they left for Zion, Noah had grown more introspective. He spent long hours redrawing the same image over and over. A narrow canyon, flanked by shadows, with two small figures in the distance. When asked why he kept drawing the same thing, he shrugged. "I just want to get it right." Some believed that Noah followed his father blindly. But that wasn't true. He followed with eyes wide open, fully aware of the weight James carried. And maybe, in some part of him, he hoped that if he mirrored his father closely enough, if he traced his steps with enough precision, he could absorb the pain, redistribute it, lessen the burden. James had taught him how to survive in the wilderness, how to keep his breath steady under pressure, how to find north without a compass. But what neither of them said aloud was that Noah had learned something even more valuable: how to sit with silence without needing to fill it, how to listen to the quiet and find meaning there. He was a boy named Echo, and like the echo in a canyon, his presence lingered, repeating, remembering, refusing to fade. They started with the obvious: the mapped routes, the permitted zones, the trails James Renner had checked off in his entry application. Rangers swept the southern paths first, expecting to find evidence of an injury, a misstep, or a mechanical failure. Something logical, something explainable. But the ground told no stories. Just endless rock, wind, and heat. Search dogs tracked what they could through the parched air, noses close to the red dust, but the scent trails cut off abruptly, as if the Renner men had vanished mid-step. Overhead, drones buzzed like mechanical flies, their cameras scanning miles of canyons for anomalies, heat signatures, disturbed earth, even the glint of metal. But what they captured, again and again, was a landscape too old and too vast to care about the sudden disappearance of two human lives. From above, Zion looked unchanged, eternal, like it had already forgotten them. Then, on the 5th day of the search, a ranger stumbled across something unusual. 2 miles off a disused fire road, now more of a faded suggestion than a path. He'd only gone that way on a hunch, following a faint indentation in the sand. A drag line, perhaps. Or nothing. But just past a low outcrop of rock, in a shallow depression shielded from view unless you were nearly on top of it, he found what looked like a small pile of gear, half covered by wind-blown sand. Not scattered, not damaged, not torn, arranged. There was a torn section of nylon, likely from a backpack, its edge seared rather than ripped, a metal flask with condensation still clinging faintly to the inside. A compass military issue, heavy brass casing, its glass cracked in a starburst, but the needle still spun when held level. And next to it, a strip of fabric camouflage, faded and sweat-stained, the kind used to wrap rifle scopes or hands in high-temperature terrain. What struck the ranger most wasn't what was found. It was what wasn't. No tracks led to or from the site. No claw marks, no prints. No signs of animal activity. In the desert, time and elements erase. But this hadn't been destroyed. It had been preserved, almost reverently. As if someone, or something, had taken care to leave behind a message with no translation. The items were bagged and catalogued. photographs taken, the coordinates logged. But even among seasoned investigators, discomfort threaded through their voices when they spoke of it later. It felt like a warning, one would mutter. Or a breadcrumb trail no one was supposed to follow. Forensics ran tests. No blood, no DNA beyond what you'd expect. The flask had traces of water untreated, suggesting it was scooped from a natural source. But none of the items gave up what mattered. The why. Why were they left there, in that place, so far from any trail or designated campsite? Why weren't they used if the pair had gotten lost? One ranger, a veteran of 23 search operations, stood at the site for nearly an hour before speaking. "This wasn't an accident," he finally said. "This was deliberate." They called the area Waypoint 1 in the reports, as if naming it might force it to make sense. But even after returning again and again, the site offered no more clues. Just that faint impression in the sand, the cracked compass still trembling northward, and a question no one could answer. Who, if anyone, was meant to find it? It felt less like a discovery, and more like a message. A sentence left unfinished, a map with no legend. 3 days after James and Noah Renner were last seen, the sky turned. It wasn't a typical desert shift, not the kind where the wind picks up and clouds graze the cliffs like passing thoughts. This was different. Aggressive. Sudden. A mass of cold air dropped from the north, colliding with the baked silence of southern Utah like a closed fist. Thunder rolled before clouds were even visible. Within hours, Zion transformed from sun-bleached cathedral to roiling nightmare. The storm came without warning. Forecasts had predicted scattered showers, nothing significant. But the atmosphere had other plans. What started as a light drizzle became a torrent. Walls of water surged down canyons that hadn't seen rain in months. Trails became rivers. Riverbeds became death traps. Flash floods ripped through narrow slots with the force of freight trains, carrying logs, boulders, and entire layers of earth in their wake. For those still in the park, it was a scramble to higher ground. Hikers were pulled from trails, tents were torn from stakes, and search operations were halted with a single directive: stand down. It was too dangerous. Too late. The terrain the Rangers had been scouring only hours before was now unrecognizable. The tire tracks they had been following? Gone. Swallowed beneath water and mud, erased like chalk under rain. When the storm finally passed, it left behind silence, not the sacred kind Zion was known for, but a hollow, uneasy quiet. The landscape bore a new face. Dry washes had shifted, ridges crumbled, pathways vanished. The desert had rearranged itself, as if trying to cover its own tracks. What had been solid ground was now uncertainty. Searchers returned to square one, only now the square had changed shape entirely. The area near Waypoint 1 had been hit hard. The shallow depression where the gear had been found was buried in silt. The surrounding rocks, once sharp and distinct, were now worn smooth by the flood. Investigators tried to recreate their steps, to re-establish the map they had begun to draw. But it was no use. The land had taken what it wanted, and left behind only questions. The dogs lost their trails. The drones flew over altered topography, confused by new shadows and reformed cliffs. Teams walked for miles and returned with nothing but blistered feet and empty packs. It was as if the storm hadn't just wiped away clues, it had reset the story. In the official reports, the language was clinical. Unusual meteorological event. Significant loss of terrain integrity. Search efforts compromised by environmental hazards. But those who'd been there, those who had felt the storm crack the sky open like a fault, line described it differently. They said it felt personal. A kind of violence that wasn't random, like the land was trying to hide something, or protect it. When the search resumed, the urgency had shifted. The family still hoped, the Rangers still tried. But the storm had changed more than just the soil. It had changed the tone. What was once a mission to find two missing people now felt like something else entirely, like they were chasing echoes in a place that no longer wanted to be understood. The trail had gone cold, not just in the way of missing clues, but in spirit, as if the desert itself had closed its eyes. And for the first time since the Renner disappearance began, those involved began to whisper what they had avoided, saying out loud, "What if the land hadn't taken them? What if it had kept them?" Victor Hale hadn't worn his uniform in years, but he still moved like a soldier, shoulders straight, steps deliberate, eyes scanning as if every shadow might hold weight. He arrived in Zion on a morning choked with dust, stepping out of a rental jeep with nothing but a rucksack and a printout of an old park map he'd folded, refolded, and marked with a single red line. He didn't check in with rangers. He didn't talk to reporters. He didn't stop at the visitor center to pick up brochures or trail conditions. He simply started walking. No one expected him. James's sister, who had last heard from Victor over a year ago, got a brief voicemail 2 days before. "I think I know where he went," Victor had said, voice dry as gravel. "I'm going out there." He offered no details, no timeline. Just conviction. Like the call wasn't a heads up, but a courtesy before disappearing into something he couldn't explain. Victor and James had served side-by-side sniper and spotter for 2 tours that bled into each other. They shared desert landscapes halfway across the world, where the sun felt just as cruel and the silences just as absolute. They'd trusted each other with their lives, relied on instinct more than conversation, and survived things neither of them fully spoke about afterward. But Victor had always known something about James that others didn't. There was a line in him, a line between the part that made it home and the part that never could. After the disappearance, Victor hadn't come right away. He followed the story from a distance, combed through reports, called in old favors, but nothing ever felt solid. Just fragments, suggestions. He told himself the case had gone cold, that there was nothing he could do. But then came the dream. He never described it in full, just said it came suddenly, vivid and strange. A flickering fire in a canyon hollow, and James sitting alone, hunched over something, a notebook maybe. In the dream, he looked up, didn't speak, just pointed. And Victor woke up with a direction. He arrived at the same trailhead James and Noah had departed from 9 months earlier. The same silence clung to the air. The same ridges loomed, unmoved. He adjusted his pack, checked the map, and set out on foot. No GPS, no backup, just memory, gut, and something quieter than either, a pull. He retraced their suspected path with startling precision, moving like he'd already been there, as if the terrain whispered secrets only he could hear. On the second night, he camped under a rock shelf just off a dried wash. The stars were too clear, the wind too still. He slept only in fragments, waking to sounds that might have been nothing or everything. On the third day, Victor veered off trail, following a thin seam in the canyon wall that no ranger report had ever mentioned. The path narrowed, shadows deepened. And just before dusk, nestled between 2 slabs of sun-warmed stone, he found it. A small object, half covered in dust and pine needles, black, weathered, and wrapped in layers of plastic and duct tape like a makeshift time capsule. A journal. He didn't open it right away. He sat with it in his lap as the sun dipped behind the cliffs, painting the canyon in bruised orange and violet. His breath caught, not in fear but in recognition. As if whatever it was, it had been waiting for him. Victor Hale had never believed in signs, but this wasn't a clue. It was a message. The canyon floor had its own voice, a soft crunch beneath boots, the occasional sigh of wind through dry grass, the distant knock of loose rock tumbling from high ledges. Victor Hale moved through it like a man chasing memory, not direction. There were no trail markers guiding his steps, only fragments from after-action reports, old satellite images, and the near-mythic instincts of a man who had once lived in the margins between movement and stillness. He hadn't spoken aloud since leaving the trailhead. Words felt too loud here, too sharp against the quiet that folded around him like a second skin. It was the same quiet he remembered from combat deployments. A watchful quiet, the kind that pressed down and made your skin tighten without knowing why. Each night, he made camp in shallow draws, setting up a modest lean-to and kindling fires so small they barely glowed. He wasn't trying to be unseen, he just didn't want to disturb whatever existed out there. The third day began before light. He broke camp while the moon still lingered in the upper sky, casting a sickly sheen on the rocks. His boots traced a route that made no tactical sense, switchbacks along the base of crumbling walls, narrow gaps between boulders, patches of land no reasonable hiker would choose. But he followed something deeper than logic. A gut pull. A kind of phantom compass. Just after midday, he climbed a narrow incline that ended in a broken ridge. The sun glared, unforgiving, and the wind shifted abruptly, bringing with it a smell that wasn't exactly rot, but old. Dry, abandoned. Below the ridge, the terrain dipped into a pocket of collapsed sandstone. It was a natural bowl, shielded from above, easy to miss unless you were directly above it. Victor descended carefully, each step deliberate, his hand brushing the wall for balance. Near the far edge, beneath a split in the stone where water must have once run, he saw it just a sliver of black, unnatural in the sea of ochre dust and sage. He knelt and cleared away the debris. A moleskin journal. Worn, bound tight in clear plastic and layers of duct tape, methodical and careful. This wasn't discarded. It had been placed. Victor held it in his hands like it might evaporate. His breath slowed. The weight of it was more than physical. It was like holding someone else's last words, someone who knew they wouldn't be able to speak them in person. The tape was brittle but intact. Whoever had sealed this had meant it to last. He didn't open it right away. Instead, he sat on the warm stone and waited. Let the stillness settle. Listened to the land breathe. His eyes scanned the surrounding cliffs, not out of fear but habit. He imagined James here, maybe crouched in this same spot, hands wrapping the journal like he'd done 100 times in the field with sensitive documents. He imagined Noah watching from nearby, silent, curious. Victor didn't cry. Soldiers like him had cried enough in places no one ever saw. But he closed his eyes, just for a moment, and let the ache bloom quietly in his chest. When he peeled back the first layer of tape, the wind gusted suddenly, stirring dust into the air, as if the desert itself had been waiting for this. A breath released, a boundary crossed. Inside that black cover was not a story told in sequence. It was fragments, thoughts, coordinates, sketches. Madness maybe, or a map. Victor didn't know yet. But he knew this. These were James Renner's words. And they were never meant to be found by just anyone. The first page bore no title, no name. Just a line drawn in pencil, sharp and straight, bisecting the page top to bottom. As though someone had tried to cleave the world in two. Beneath it, a single word, divide. The handwriting was unmistakably James's precise military block letters that had once filled after-action reports and rifle maintenance logs. But here, they were different, unsteady in places, hesitant. Like each word had to fight its way out of his hand. Victor turned the page carefully. Not because it was fragile, but because something about it felt sacred. The next spread was blank except for what looked like a topographical sketch, a canyon cleft with jagged lines, and an X marked in the crook where two ridges converged. No legend, no trail names. Just a pair of numbers scrawled in the margin. 37.2759, negative 113.0457. There were more of them. Pages filled with symbols that straddled the line between military notation and something older, stranger. Spirals. Triangles within circles. One page bore only a date, written again and again across the surface until the paper had torn beneath the pencil point. 8.17. Again. 8.17. Again. No context, no explanation. Just repetition. As if James had been trying to hold onto a moment before it slipped away. Victor recognized signs of trauma in ink. Some pages held full sentences, then abruptly stopped mid-thought. Others were just words repeated obsessively. Watchers, echo, no face, no eyes, too tall. At first, it read like the unraveling of a mind frayed by isolation and fear. A man slowly losing grip in the vast, silent wild. But it wasn't all madness. There were entries that bore the clear structure of reconnaissance notes. Observations taken from a distance. Movement on the West Ridge, figures not responding to hailing. Observed from 2000, 200 to 0, 4, 1, 5. No sleep, no food, no speech. Noah unaware, keeping him close. Not alerting. These weren't hallucinations. At least not to James. He was tracking something or someone, with the same diligence he once reserved for enemy patrols. The handwriting in those moments grew crisp again, confident. The soldier resurfacing. And then came a page that chilled Victor more than all the others. It simply read, "There is a cave. They wait inside. I heard them when I was alone. Noah didn't. Or maybe he pretended not to. I don't know which scares me more." The page after that was covered entirely in charcoal. Rubbed edge to edge in darkness, with a single phrase carved out using the tip of a blade. "It doesn't end when you leave." Victor sat with the journal for hours, thumbing through the madness and method. It was a mosaic of a mind at war, not with insurgents or enemies, but with something nameless, something woven into the land itself. He found sketches more like frantic etchings of faceless figures standing at impossible angles, long-limbed and watching. A child's silhouette nearby, always close, always looking away. This wasn't a survival log. There were no records of food, no water rations, no plans to signal for help. It wasn't even a goodbye letter. It was a map of descent, a confession, or a record of what happens when silence grows too loud to bear. James Renner had known fear. He'd written reports over the bodies of men he'd killed, made peace with the weight of necessary violence. But this was different. Even war hadn't prepared him for what he found in that canyon. And now Victor was left to ask himself the most dangerous question of all. What if it wasn't madness? What if it was real? They appeared first as shadows on the periphery. Hints of movement James couldn't attribute to wind or wildlife. Shapes that lingered just long enough to raise the hairs on the back of his neck. In the early journal entries, they were mentioned only in passing, possible hikers on ridge, presence noted at 0600, unverified. The soldier in him still demanded objectivity, still clung to structure. But as the pages progressed, the language shifted. The distance between what he saw and what he feared narrowed. The entries grew more urgent, more uncertain. Less reconnaissance, more revelation. "They're still watching," one line read. Underscored with such pressure that the pencil had nearly torn through the page. Always from above, no tracks, no sound. Just watching. Victor had paused when he first read it, imagining his friend crouched beneath a bluff, staring through binoculars at figures that did not behave like any animal or man he knew. It wasn't paranoia, not at first. It was pattern recognition. James was trained to notice what others missed: movement, rhythm, the shift in a landscape's breath. And what he saw were watchers. "Noah doesn't see them yet," another entry recorded, scrawled in jagged strokes. "But I do. They stay still too long. They don't blink. They're not lost. They're not here for shelter. They're waiting." James began calling them the observers, as if naming them gave some semblance of control. He stopped drawing their outlines after a while. Said it made them stronger. The pages around those entries turned darker. Not metaphorically, literally. Smudged charcoal and fingerprints where hands had gripped too tightly. Scribbles layered over previous thoughts, as though James had attempted to cross something out only to obsessively return to it. There was something intimate and frightening in the way he tried to reason through the inexplicable. Not once did he leap to the word supernatural. He stayed grounded in detail, height estimates, angles of approach, the unnatural stillness of their posture. And always, always from the cliffs. The watchers never descended, never approached, but they never retreated either, as if they were tethered to the high places of Zion, ancient and patient, content to observe the slow unraveling below. James started to suspect a locus point as center of gravity. He referenced a place multiple times, almost reluctantly, as though the very idea of it resisted ink. A cave. Not listed on any maps. Hidden behind a knot of twisted juniper, marked only by a white stone the size of a child's head. He described the tree in unsettling detail, bent unnaturally, like it had grown in pain, its bark scarred with gashes too, even to be natural. He never claimed to enter the cave, only that he approached it, that standing near it made his vision blur, that Noah cried the night they camped closest to it, though the boy wouldn't say why. "He looked at me like he knew I'd already been there," one line whispered. As the journal wore on, even James's military rigidity broke down. Sentences trailed off, dates stopped appearing. What remained were scattered entries, desperate and trembling, as though written while glancing over his shoulder. "I'm not afraid of dying," he wrote near the back, "but I'm afraid of being seen by them and still not understood." The final mention of the watchers came without punctuation. "They don't need to chase. They wait for you to find the cave, they already know who will." Victor closed the book slowly after reading that line, the desert air pressing in heavier than before. In the cliffs around him, nothing moved, no shapes, no shadows. But he felt them. The phantom watchers, and their silence. Near the back of the journal, wedged between loose pages and a folded map darkened by sweat and time, were the drawings. Noah's. At first, they looked like nothing, just pencil outlines on crinkled paper, the rough, restless work of a teenager trying to pass time in a quiet place. But as Victor unfolded them one by one beneath the low light of his campfire, a different truth took shape. These weren't idle sketches. These were records. Testimonies from a boy who had been watching, and perhaps being watched. Noah's hand was careful, precise, almost too steady for someone his age. There were no captions, no titles, no dates, just images. Charcoal smudges where trees met cliff walls, jagged silhouettes of towering rock, and then figures, always in the background, always just far enough to blur into the terrain. Not men, not animals, something else. One drawing showed the edge of a campfire. Their bikes leaned neatly against a rock, the stars above sketched with faint dots. But beyond the firelight, high on a ledge, three shapes loomed. They weren't detailed. Noah hadn't drawn eyes or mouths. Just the outline of bodies, impossibly long and still, standing shoulder to shoulder like statues made of dusk. In another drawing, he captured his father asleep, curled beneath his tarp, his rifle resting beside him, hands still close to the grip. The detail was intimate: James's boots half unlaced, a torn patch on his jacket shoulder, the curve of his chest rising in sleep. And again, there in the background, the shadows. They weren't mistakes. Each figure was drawn deliberately. Noah hadn't exaggerated their height, hadn't added claws or horns or anything sensational. That was what made them more terrifying. They were quiet, ordinary in shape, but wrong in placement. Like they existed just outside the frame of logic, observing from some inhuman stillness. Victor flipped to a drawing that chilled him more than the others. It was unfinished, just a canyon wall, the suggestion of a narrow opening, and Noah's own figure standing in front of it. The boy's eyes, unlike the other faceless sketches, were open and wide. Inside the cave's mouth, Faint lines suggested movement. A blur of hands? Smoke? It was impossible to tell. But the image radiated unease, like something seen but never meant to be remembered. There were at least a dozen of them, folded and worn, some torn at the edges. In one, the watchers had no heads at all. In another, they seemed to multiply 4, then 5, then 7, each figure drawn closer to the foreground than before. One had a hand raised, fingers impossibly long, not in threat but in greeting. Or warning. Victor held each page like it might crumble in his hands. These weren't just drawings, they were Noah's way of processing what he couldn't say. James had written about the Watchers, about being followed, about the cave, but Noah had seen them too. Not in metaphor, in graphite, in repetition, in the way a child tries to anchor himself to truth through pictures when language fails. And what haunted Victor most wasn't what was drawn, but what was missing. There were no images of Noah after the cave, as if he'd stopped drawing, or had nothing left to draw. The coordinates weren't exact. They never are. Not in places like Zion where the land folds into itself in layers of sandstone and silence. But Victor knew how to read between numbers. He understood terrain the way others understood, language, slope and shade, erosion lines and wind paths. The journal didn't hand him a location. It gave him an intent, and that was enough. He left at first light, traveling light, carrying only the journal, water, and a knife. The deeper he went, the more the landscape narrowed around him. Trees thinned. Grass died back into cracked earth. The sun pressed down without mercy, but Victor didn't feel heat the way others did anymore. He just moved, step after deliberate step, through dry washes and along ridgelines that looked identical to the untrained eye. He passed rock formations that seemed to watch, heard no birds, saw no insects. Hours passed in silence until the land dipped unexpectedly, revealing a shallow basin nestled between two crumbling buttes. It wasn't marked on any map, nor did it bear any indication that it had ever been visited. The valley floor was dry, choked with brittle scrub, and long dead streambeds that twisted like veins beneath the sand. Victor scanned the area, eyes methodical. One stone outcropping looked darker than the rest. He approached. The overlook had partially collapsed, the edge flaked off like torn paper. Below it, nearly hidden by shadow and time, was a thin vertical slit in the rock face. It didn't look like a cave or a passage. It looked like damage, an accidental tear in the stone. Victor almost passed it, but something held him there. A tension in the air, a weight in his gut. He crouched low and slipped sideways through the crevice, shoulders scraping stone. It was tight, claustrophobic, just wide enough to allow him entry. Inside, the temperature dropped, and the light dimmed to a pale gray. The air smelled scorched, not fresh fire but old burn. He flicked on his headlamp and scanned the hollow. At first, it seemed empty, just a pocket of space the size of a walk-in closet. But near the far wall, the beam of his light caught blackened marked soot. Long ago, but not ancient. He stepped closer, crouching beside the circle of ash. The remains were cold, inert. But in their center, something pale peeked from beneath the char. Paper. He reached in carefully and pulled it free. It crumbled at the edges, brittle with time and smoke, but the image was unmistakable. A photograph. Burnt along one side, warped and curled, but still visible. James and Noah. Sitting beside their bikes, backs to the camera, looking out over a ridge. A snapshot from another life, one that belonged to movement, to plans, to survival. Half of James's face was gone, burnt into shadow. Noah remained intact, though the fire had licked at his edges, giving him the look of someone halfway out of existence. Victor stared at the photo, his breath shallow. This wasn't a campsite. It was a hiding place. Or a graveyard. Or a shrine. Someone had stayed here. Someone had tried to destroy something, but not completely. as if unsure whether to let go or leave a message. The ashes told no stories. The photo whispered only absence. Coordinates, yes, but not a destination. Just a place left behind by those who no longer needed maps. The crevice gave way to something larger, a hollowed alcove tucked behind ancient stone, concealed not by distance but by indifference. This was a place the desert had chosen to forget. Victor stepped further inside, the beam of his flashlight sweeping across the uneven floor, catching glimpses of what once might have been a makeshift shelter. But the word shelter felt wrong. This wasn't built. It was occupied briefly, quietly, with no intention of permanence. There was no smell of death, no rot, no blood darkening the dust. But the space carried the unmistakable scent of absence, an emptiness that felt used. Like the walls had once absorbed breath and sweat and silence, and now held only the echo of those things. It was more than loneliness. It was the aftertaste of something unfinished. In the corner, barely visible beneath a thin layer of sand, Victor found a torn section of blanket. The fabric was frayed and brittle, as if it had been exposed to sun and wind for months. Not shredded, not chewed cut. Beside it, a small pile of stones had been arranged into a triangle. Not random, deliberate. A signal? A ritual? Or simply a moment of human instinct in a place that offered none? He crouched low, examining the ground. Boot prints faint, but present. 2 different sizes, one larger, one lighter. James and Noah. They had been here. For how long, he couldn't tell. But long enough to leave behind more than footprints. A cracked lens cap lay half buried under a thin rock, the plastic warped by heat. Standard GoPro, one they likely used to document their journey. But the camera itself was nowhere to be seen. He imagined the boy Noah curled up beneath that shredded blanket, drawing in the quiet, his father pacing the edge of the crevice like a soldier on a perimeter, waiting, listening, watching. For what, Victor couldn't say. But the air felt thick with expectation, like whatever they'd anticipated never arrived or arrived in a way they hadn't understood. There were other small signs. A belt looped through the handle of a rusted camp knife, the blade missing. A crushed granola wrapper, its label faded. A rock stained with something too old to name ash or soot or time. Victor ran his fingers along the wall and felt the faint indent of something carved into the stone, nearly worn away. It looked like an eye. Or maybe it was just erosion. In places like this, the difference blurred. But what struck him more than the artifacts was what wasn't there. No bodies, no struggle. No frantic scrawlings of final thoughts or desperate messages to be found. Just the kind of quiet that feels like a held breath, never released. It was as if they'd stood, father and son, gathered their things or didn't, and walked away. Not in fear, not in panic, but in purpose. Victor stood there for a long time, listening to a silence so deep it pressed into his bones. The place didn't feel abandoned, it felt concluded. As though their story here had ended, and not in death, but in disappearance, in choice. He didn't call it in, not yet. What would he even say? He wasn't standing in a crime scene. He was standing in the residue of 2 people who had crossed an unseen threshold, and simply never looked back. The final page wasn't at the end. Victor found it folded and tucked into the middle of the journal, as if James hadn't wanted it to be discovered too easily, like it was meant to be read only when the reader was ready. The paper was different than the rest. Thicker, cleaner, untouched by weather or ash. The edges were unwrinkled, protected by the surrounding pages that bore the scars of desperation. It was as if James had written it in a different state of mind. Not clearer, necessarily, but resolved. The handwriting was James's, unmistakably so. But it had lost the rigid, tactical sharpness Victor knew. The letters curved more, slanted slightly, like they were being pulled by gravity or fatigue. Yet each word had weight. Not a single letter strayed or hesitated. "If you're reading this," it began, "we're not dead. But we're not who we were." Victor read it aloud, the words catching in his throat, not because they were dramatic, but because they felt true. The tone wasn't panicked or afraid. It was calm, heavy with acceptance. James hadn't lost his mind. He hadn't snapped. He had made a decision, one Victor still couldn't name. "I hope Echo can forget what I couldn't." The line struck like a blade. Not because of the mystery, but because of the love buried in it. Noah, his son, had always been more than just a travel companion or a symbol of hope. He was James's tether to the world. And yet, even here, James seemed to acknowledge a parting. Not just from the world of roads and names and rules, but from the person he'd once been. The man who had tried to outrun the ghosts of war. The father who'd thought motion could replace healing. "I hope the Watchers don't follow you too." It was the only line that wavered slightly, the graphite darker, as though James had pressed harder here. Not a warning shouted into the void, but a whisper from someone who had crossed into something else. Victor glanced toward the crevice's opening, half expecting movement against the light. Nothing. Just stillness. But the phrase lingered, clawed at his thoughts. And then, beneath it, a set of coordinates. New ones. Not the place where the journal was found. Further west, deeper into the park. Closer to where the cliffs narrowed and the maps faded into guesswork. Victor recognized the numbers. He'd seen them marked faintly in the margins of one of Noah's earlier drawings, etched into the background like a detail meant only for those who knew to look. Below the coordinates came the last line. "Would you leave your shadow behind?" Victor stared at it for a long time, unsure if it was a metaphor or a challenge. In combat, your shadow was your position, your giveaway, the thing that betrayed you to an enemy. But here, it meant something more, something elemental. Would you let go of everything that tethered you to who you'd been? Could you? Should you? He folded the page and placed it back exactly where he'd found it. His hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the weight of it all. The truth wasn't written in blood or revealed through violence. It was in the absence, the decision to disappear not as a surrender, but as a transformation. James Renner hadn't just walked off into the desert. He had chosen to cross into something beyond understanding. And he had left behind a single, quiet question for anyone who might follow. Would you? When Victor Hale emerged from the backcountry, the change in him was immediate, though not dramatic. He looked the same, weathered, lean, with a 1,000-yard stare that had long ago taken root in his eyes. But something fundamental had shifted beneath the surface, as if he'd been rewired in silence. He didn't speak for hours after returning to the ranger station, not even when handed water and offered a clean cot. He sat outside instead, boots coated in dust, face upturned toward the horizon, as if still listening for something the rest of them couldn't hear. When the rangers finally pressed him, gently, cautiously, he answered only what they asked. No elaboration, no speculation. Just a few words delivered with the flat certainty of someone who had stopped needing to convince anyone of anything. They weren't running from something out there, he said. They were running toward it. The statement offered no comfort. If anything, it unsettled the team further. Up to that point, every theory had hinged on panic injury, disorientation, an accident escalating into tragedy. But Victor spoke with the conviction of a man who had seen evidence of purpose, of choice, not escape, transformation. He refused interviews, declined to give a statement to the press. When a local journalist asked to speak with him, off the record, just to help make sense of it, Victor shook his head once and walked away. He didn't owe the world answers, and he no longer seemed interested in offering them. He left the journal with James's sister, drove out to her home without warning, handed it to her wrapped in the same plastic he'd found it in, and said only, "He wanted you to have this." She tried to press for more, her voice cracking under the weight of 9 months of grief and sleepless nights. But Victor's face told her that whatever he'd seen, whatever he now carried, it couldn't be translated into language. It was beyond words, beyond even grief. She opened the journal days later, sitting at her kitchen table in the same chair she used to write birthday cards to Noah. She read through it slowly, stopping often. Sometimes not because she was overwhelmed, but because she could sense when she was stepping into something sacred, something meant only for those who understood how silence could be heavier than sound. When she reached the final page, she didn't cry. She simply sat there, one hand resting on the cover, the other gripping the table's edge as though bracing for a wave that never came. Victor didn't go home. His apartment in Nevada remained untouched, rent unpaid. His Jeep was found a week later parked at a truck stop 3 states away, keys on the dash, no sign of struggle or disarray. No forwarding address, no farewell note. Some believed he had taken his own life, unable to bear the burden of what he'd learned. Others were certain he'd returned to the wilderness to follow the final coordinates, to find his own shadow or leave it behind. But those who truly knew him, the few left who had seen the changes war could carve into a man's soul, suspected something quieter, that he hadn't disappeared in despair, but in conviction. That whatever James and Noah had found out there, Victor hadn't just witnessed it, he'd accepted it. And then, like them, he stepped forward into whatever lay beyond the trail's end. The trailhead looks no different now than it did the day James and Noah Renner vanished. A wooden sign bleached from years of sun still marks the beginning of the path. A rusted trail map, tucked beneath weather-warped plexiglass, displays the same loops, the same warning symbols about heat, dehydration, and flash floods. On weekends, tourists line up beneath it to snap photos before heading out. Couples in matching hiking gear, college students filming vlogs, families with kids hoisting backpacks too large for their frames. They smile, they laugh. They read the posted history without knowing which parts were added after. Without knowing that every few months, another visitor lingers too long at the base of the trail, staring at the horizon like it's whispering something only they can hear. Nothing in the official park literature mentions the Renners anymore. It was never part of the brochure. Their story has become a footnote, buried under the language of unsolved disappearance and inclement weather. The trail has been reopened, patrolled, remarked. New hikers pass over the same ground that was once combed by search parties and bloodhounds. And yet, nothing's been paved. Nothing's been explained. Some say that's how it should be. Rangers will tell you the area is safe, that all trailheads are routinely maintained, that the storm 9 months ago was a rare anomaly, and that Zion is as beautiful and welcoming as ever. They say the sightings flickers of movement in places no hiker should be. The faint red-orange glow of a campfire far out on an unapproved ridge are nothing more than atmospheric illusion. Refractions. The canyon plays tricks when the air is just right. But the locals speak differently. They talk about the silence that falls too suddenly in that valley, the kind that doesn't feel like peace but like breath being held. They mention the way birds avoid that stretch of rock, how dogs will bark wildly and refuse to follow. And sometimes, at night, from the highway overlook, drivers claim to see the faint pulse of a firelight where no camp is listed, where no trail leads. It vanishes before anyone can confirm it. But it returns, flickering, waiting. There's one story passed quietly among the older guides that a solo hiker once wandered off that trail during the early spring, chasing a shape he thought was another person. He followed it for hours, deeper and deeper, until he reached a part of the park that wasn't on his map. He came back days later, dirty, dehydrated, eyes bloodshot and wild. When asked where he'd been, he only said, "They were watching me sleep." He refused to say more, moved away from the state soon after. Every so often, someone asks about the Renners, usually after seeing a photo or hearing about the journal that was handed over and never released to the public. Rangers keep their answers brief. James and Noah went missing. The search was exhaustive, there was no foul play. But if you walk that trail alone, and the sun is low enough, you may notice the air start to hum. You may see what looks like tire tracks in the dust, two sets, riding side by side. You may hear something distant, the hiss of a campfire, the whisper of gears turning. And just beyond the ridge, where the trail bends and the maps go blank, you might feel it. Like someone is still out there. Still moving. Still waiting for someone else to follow. Behind glass, beneath the soft glow of curated lighting, Noah Renner's sketchbook sits in quiet display. The museum calls it a recovered artifact, a sterile phrase that fails to capture the weight of it. Visitors pass by, many not knowing the story, not recognizing the smudged graphite strokes for what they are, breadcrumbs through an unsolvable grief. They pause briefly, glance at the open pages, and then move on toward brighter, more understandable exhibits. But some linger, some lean in and read the small plaque beside it, and fewer still, those who know the full story or feel it, even if they don't stay a little longer. The pages are warped from moisture and time, the binding frayed, but the sketches remain, shadows without faces, eyes that were never drawn but always felt. Noah never signed his name anywhere in the book, never dated a page, but his presence is unmistakable. His pencil lines speak where his voice never had the chance. They tell a story that couldn't be written, that couldn't be captured in any official report or public search document. A story that unfolds in shapes and absences, in ridgelines and empty silhouettes that hover just out of reach. One image is permanently on display, a half-finished sketch of two figures on bikes, riding into the mouth of a canyon. The boy's head is turned slightly, as if glancing back. The man beside him is steady, forward-facing. But behind them, in the far corner of the image, are the faintest marks. Not quite people, not quite anything. Just watchers. Beside the case, framed in minimalist black, is a single handwritten note. The paper is plain. The handwriting familiar to a few and unknown to most. Below the sketchbook, etched in Victor Hale's own sharp, compact script, are the words, "Some echoes fade, some become the canyon itself." He left the note without ceremony, without explanation. Slipped it into the curator's hands one early morning and disappeared before questions could form. It's the last known message from him. No one's seen him since. The display draws quiet reverence now. Visitors don't take selfies in front of it, they whisper. Some press their hands lightly to the glass, unsure why they feel such a heavy sadness over a boy they've never met. Over a story that never found its ending. Because there was no closure, no remains. No confirmed death certificate. Just a journal retrieved from beneath a rock, and a sketchbook that told the rest in silence. The land gave nothing back, except hints, fragments, and that lingering feeling of something unfinished, something waiting. Zion continues, vast and unmoved. The trail is still walked. The crevice still unknown to most. The cave, if it was ever real, remains hidden. But sometimes hikers report strange feelings, the sense that they are not alone, that someone watches, that something listens. And sometimes, in the deepest folds of the park, a voice seems to ride on the wind, faint and young, like a boy speaking from another world entirely. Saying nothing, yet reminding those who hear it that he was once here. Not lost. Not gone. Just part of the canyon now, part of what echoes leave behind.